Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Professor Cerulli. Thanks to the Center for South Asia, and specifically Koya for inviting me here. It's great to be here. I'm glad the weather is not terrible. I'm from San Diego, and it's just nice every day. So I'm glad that I'm sorry to push that on you, but at least it's not snowing or raining.
You get an audience on your side.
Right, yeah, sorry. Anyway, I'm excited to share this new work with you. This is going to be the final chapter of my book that will hopefully be finished sometime around next fall. It is still very much kind of in motion and in development, and I expect to speak for something like 35 minutes or so, hoping that there will be some time to have some kind of robust conversation afterwards. Okay. So Pushkar is a town in northwestern India whose population of roughly 20,000 sees an influx of 2 million visitors each year. In addition to being an important Hindu pilgrimage place, it's also received considerable attention from the international tourist community, a group with distinctly hippie beginnings, but which now includes visitors from a wide range of social positions. And yet, despite the diversity of both hosts and guests, people there seem to agree that Pushkar is a place of peace. Indeed, shanti is a word used day after day, a casual observation flowing mantra-like from mouths across the bazaar in restaurants, hotels, and temples. For locals especially, this same observation of shanti is often accompanied by a whole series of gestures, head tilted up, satisfied smile, eyes closed, occasionally fingertips to the temple's shanti. But those who have been to this tiny town in the heart of Rajasthan know that Pushkar is not a quiet place. There are, among other things, honking horns, crackling loudspeakers, hawkers with their wares, sadhus demanding alms, trance music, and tractors. Peace, but no quiet. Today, I'll address this ostensible paradox by exploring the creation and maintenance of peace in Pushkar. Far from attempting to silence Pushkar's rich soundscape, locals instead find peace by adding yet more sound to the atmosphere. They do this with songs and recitations, sacred words set on speakers and intended to send good vibrations through the ether. In such a setting of competing soundscapes, vibrations bring peace where there is no quiet. But what is the nature of this peace, and where does this vibratory rhetoric come from? Because of Pushkar's status as a tourist destination and the training associated with working with the tourist economy, the town's discourse is saturated by an impressive collection of commonly used sayings and phrases. In other words, locals working in the axis of tourism and pilgrimage have created for themselves a kind of phrase factory where stock answers and digestible bits of wisdom sit ready at the tips of tongues. While not the subject of this paper, the phrase factory nevertheless shapes the ethnographic landscape in which my work is situated. And here its significance lies simply in the fact that shanti is one such word, deployed and circulated around town, picked up and passed back and forth over and over. And it really works. During my fieldwork, this discursive saturation seemed especially effective for international tourists of the backpacking variety. People who would lounge around in Pushkar's many cafes, reading books and drinking chai and smoking spliffs. To them, Pushkar was an escape from that other India over the hills, the India of urban jungles like Ajmer, Jaipur, and Delhi. These folks would relax in Pushkar for a number of days, and the word that came to describe their stay almost inevitably was shanti. One British tourist named Adam even said that the language of shanti was so pervasive as to make it contagious. He had likely heard the word before, popping up as it does in some kind of random and curious places like Madonna lyrics, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, the ravings of Michael Caine in Michael Caine's character in the film Children of Men. But before coming to Pushkar, Adam had never actually used the word in a sentence, and now had trouble talking about his recent experiences without simply saying shanti. Shanti. Now, part of what makes the phrase factory so interesting is that repetition makes reality. And so regardless of how or why certain idioms of expression have come to be so popular and pervasive, it's simply the case that idioms take hold, and even for locals. However, for locals, shanti is far from foreign. It's a term extremely common in the Hindu world, found in a wide range of Sanskrit texts and often affixed to the end of various mantras with the chant Om Shantihi, Shantihi, Shantihi. But what does it mean? Well, For most of my Indian informants, shanti was peace in a fairly vague sense, a state of mind unburdened by the anxieties that come along with money problems, family conflict, or any number of issues related to tension, that all-popular English word. In certain cases, to find shanti meant escaping the bustle of the main bazaar and relaxing by some shady spot on the outside of town. That's to say, by finding peace and quiet. But one experience fairly early in my fieldwork led me to realize that this was far from the only way to conceptualize shanti. I was sitting with a friend at his shop by Pushkar's main bus stand. This friend runs a not-so-successful travel agency, so we were sitting alone and drinking chai out of small plastic cups as buses and motorcycles and scooters and cows passed by. We were talking about Pushkar, what it's like to live there, why he likes it, etc. And like so many informants before him, he took a deep, satisfied breath and said, "Yahan bahut shanti milti hai." Here, there is a lot of shanti. There was, I thought, real comedy in this statement. Here we were, basically just outside the bus stands, with vehicles of all sorts and sizes passing by, horns blaring of all sorts of varieties, and this person is telling me that it's really peaceful here. I actually did laugh, though he didn't, and that got me thinking. Perhaps peace does not require quiet. But then what makes shanti? One easy answer is the Veda. So let me begin by way of invocation. Here is a translated passage from the Yajurveda, a mantra that I heard recited again and again in Pushkar, marking the conclusion of any number of Vedic rituals and wishing shanti into the world. May the sky be peaceful. May space be peaceful. May the earth be peaceful. May the waters be peaceful. May the trees be peaceful. May all gods be peaceful. May Brahman be peaceful. May everything be peaceful. Peace, indeed peace. May that peace come to me. Om, peace, peace, peace. Shanti, shanti, shanti. As mentioned earlier, shanti is very much a part of the Vedic corpus and thus supplies more than a few threads to this vast tapestry we call Hinduism. And while Axel Michaels has argued that, quote, most Indians today merely pay lip service to the Veda and have no regard for the contents of the text, this is not the case for Pushkar. Michael's contention may hold in other places, but Pushkar stands as an exception to the rule, in part because of its unusually high proportion of Brahmins. Local estimations suggest somewhere between 30 and 50%. Of course, we can't be certain about these numbers, basically because government censuses prohibit identification by caste, but it's definitely the case that the town's priestly presence is far larger than the national average, which people believe to be around 3.5%. So for this extremely present and powerful demographic, the Veda constitutes the very root of Hinduism. It's not a mere collection of texts to which one pays lip service, but something that quite fundamentally shapes lives and landscapes. And contrary to most expectations, commitment to the Veda has actually only increased with Pushkar's younger generations. This is due largely to the founding of 2 Sanskrit schools in 2005. Of the two, the smaller one is really just a mid-sized room, smaller, in fact, than this room here, and it lies near the banks of Pushkar Lake. It's a part-time school for part-time students, a daily opportunity for local Brahmins ranging in age from 8 to 40 or so to come for an hour or two in the afternoon in order to study the Yajurveda, which is part of the Veda that pertains to religious offerings and sacrificial formulas used in a vast range of ritual actions. The goal here is simple: to learn the Yajurveda so as to become more effective at priestcraft, and to garner some of the authority that comes from Sanskrit learning. In Pushkar's competitive economic climate, where the supply of priests far outweighs the demand, these young Brahmins can get an edge and a few extra rupees by knowing their stuff. They see it more holistically, of course, as an endeavor that has incredible dharmic and karmic value, and one that will also, at the same time, help them become more successful priests, the more successful priests that they hope to be. As one student said, quote, "There is no lack of benefit in recitation, because if God is pleased, everyone is pleased." The second Sanskrit school takes this very sentiment that there's no lack of benefit from recitation to its extreme. This substantially larger school is fully full-time, where students eat, breathe, and sleep Sanskrit 24/7, 7 days a week for a minimum of 6 years. The students are all boys in their teens, and like the other school, they are all Brahmins. But this school has students from all over Rajasthan, and the aspirations entertained there are far more ambitious than those of the smaller school. Simply put, they study Sanskrit to save the world. In case you're wondering, the reason the world needs saving is because we live in the Kali Yuga, this present degraded age where righteousness goes undefended. This is a widely, I'm sure many of you have heard this, is a widely deployed idiom across India, and when deployed by the relatively privileged, expresses the idea that the world simply isn't quite right, and that things were likely better at some point in the past. At some point in the imagined past, really. As Philip Luckendorf argues, rather than referring to a particular era, the Kali Yuga probably serves more as a kind of discursive statement on, quote, the human condition, an expression of the inevitability of vitiation and decline, and of the unending battle to retain purity and potency. For those in the Sanskrit school, and actually for many in Pushkar, decline is marked by the status of Brahmins in India, which they believe to be pretty dismal, frankly. According to them, Brahmins today eat meat, they drink alcohol, they don't keep their top knots. In other words, they've forgotten some of the most basic features of Brahmanness. And if Brahmins are, quote, the guru of all castes, as one of the school teachers remarked, then society's lot improves when Brahmins improve theirs. Part and parcel of this regime of self-improvement, then, is the study and dissemination of the Veda. We will spread the Veda. This was the constant overture. Ved ka prachar karenge. One student called up the image of a tree, with each future graduate going out to establish their own schools, their own branches, teaching students in Sanskrit and the Veda, who will themselves do the same thing. On and on, spreading Sanskrit across the land. Another student had the same thought, but with a different analogy. Each one of them, he said, was like a flaming lamp that could set alight other lamps across the country. And together they could, with time and teaching, illuminate India. So however you see it, tree or flame, growth or illumination, the students take this task as constitutive of saving India and Indian culture in the Kali Yuga. But what is it exactly that follows from the Veda to make, that allows for the Veda rather, to make a Brahmin a better Brahmin or a place a better place? You likely already know the answer. It's shanti. Indeed, many explain that the Veda has a power to purify the atmosphere. By reciting it or even by simply hearing it sound, one gets mansik shanti, or mental peace. One student went so far as to make the distinction between mental peace and outer peace. You can get peace, outer peace, from doing other things, but not mental peace, he said. From doing religious things, you get mental peace. Thus, this somehow rarer and more pressing mental peace has the power to change people, suggesting that the kind of shanti yielded from Vedic recitation is both enduring and essential to any campaign against the Kali Yuga. In his book Sonic Theology, Guy Beck considers Hinduism a fundamentally sonic religious tradition, and observes that while scholars of religion have, quote, routinely conducted research into sacred space and sacred time, they have curiously overlooked or overheard the dimension of sacred sound. Taking this observation as an invitation, I've begun to explore this idea of sacred sound in Hindu traditions, and even more explicitly, to depart from philosophical theories of sonic significance and see instead what the making of a Hindu soundscape might look like ethnographically, on the ground and in real time. The ethnographic example I use, of course, is Pushkar, but I'm also thinking alongside Charles Hirschkin's The Ethical Soundscape, a really fabulous ethnography of Muslim cassette sermons in Egypt. Among other things, Hirschkin claims that the contribution sermons make in shaping the moral and political landscape of Egypt emerges not solely from their ability to disseminate ideas or instill religious ideologies, but their effect on the human sensorium. In other words, and in possibly simplifying an incredibly rich and complex work, he's less concerned with how cassette sermons make you think, and more concerned with how they make you feel. I argue that the Hindu soundscape works in much the same way. Take, for example, this one elderly man, turbaned with a white stubbly beard and thick bottle-cap glasses, who stands in Pushkar's main bazaar chanting Ram into a microphone over and over for hours a day. Ram, Ram. What is going on here? Well, of the many mantras used in Hindu ritual life, Ram is one of the simplest and one of the most common. And as Harold Coward and David Goa argue, it's widely held that the holiness of a mantra is intrinsic, that one participates in it not by, quote, discursive understanding, but by hearing and reciting it. Jan Gonda echoes the same sentiment, saying that it's generally admitted that mantras exert extraordinary power, with which they are vested not so much through expressing a semantic sense, but through their, quote, sound vibrations. Thus, on a strict plane of meaning, there's no there to certain mantras, no message or explicit ideology. Instead, they possess a power beyond meaning. Such powers are fairly wide-ranging, from opening third eyes to uncovering absolute capital T truths. But most in Pushkar would agree that at a very minimum, a mantra like Ram would make you feel something. Calm, tranquil, peaceful. In short, shanti. Thus, this man on the microphone participates in the making of a Hindu soundscape, where shanti, as a kind of affective, sensorial experience, constitutes an integral aspect. As alluded to above, any gesture towards understanding the Hindu soundscape requires an examination of vibrations. Indeed, if shanti is the end result, then vibrations are the process. They are, among other things, produced, disseminated, and absorbed. So how do vibrations work? As you might expect, the principles and rules here are far from hard and fast, or as they say in Hindi, hard and fast nahi. And thus the diversity of responses I've received are both quite substantial and at times contradictory. Not only that, but while vibrations are often an integral part of both shanti and the Hindu soundscape, they also exist apart from it. So here are some general observations. To start, we all have a vibratory aura. When you meet a person and decide you like them, that's because your auras are in tune with one another. The opposite happens too when you realize you dislike a person, and it's likely because your auras are literally not on the same wavelength. The same is true again of places. Hemant, a close friend and collaborator, told me about his ideal of finding some perfect place outside the bustle of town and temple where he could find some peace. Here he says, you go there and you think, that's paradise for me. That's the vibration or some energy that makes you feel, this is what I'm looking for, and it makes you happy. When both vibrations match, then the attachment between that place and you, that shows you like that place, and that place shows you some sign. End quote. Important here is Hemant's exclamation, that's paradise for me. Indeed, these special locations where vibratory auras of person and place harmonize vary with the individual. Hemant desires a quiet place on the outskirts of town, but in the same vein, we can again recall my friend who finds shanti sitting on a bus bench by the bus stand, with horns blaring and ambient dust slowly descending into her cup of chai. So one person's shanti can be another's nightmare. But then again, some places emit overwhelmingly positive vibrations, and thus are not subject to what we might call the vibratory match theory as presented by Hemant. Pushkar, as you might expect, is one such place. A tour guide named Anil compared the creation of Pushkar, and specifically its status as a sacred place, to that of a rose flower. The rose, he said, needs the right combination of earth, air, and water. You can only grow a rose in special places. And in that same way, this Pushkar has become a pilgrimage place, and there are definitely vibrations. This same tour guide explained that because Pushkar's vibrational power is inherent, it's because it's always there, and thus accessible regardless of whether a person does a particular set of rituals, it's available to all people of all religious traditions. Anyone can come, he said. And if you have devotion, bhakti, if you believe, and if you meditate upon it, this energy is there for you. And I often found this statement corroborated when speaking with tourists. For example, Sumita, a tourist from Delhi, told me that, quote, if you want to sit, meditate, read, write, this is the place. Pushkar has a very special vibration. You can just pick it up. But beyond sharing wavelengths and resonating with Pushkar, vibrations can also be spread. Most fundamentally, this is done with the spoken word. Although it may be a platitude to say that words have consequences, in the view of many present-day Hindus, utterances travel the world in the form of vibrations that shape the atmosphere of particular places. And for locals especially, the idea is to produce good vibrations so as to maintain Pushkar's already peaceful atmosphere. So how is this done? Well, most basically one is expected to speak well, which is to say carefully, calmly, and honestly. But even more effective than moral speech is the powerful vibratory potential of recitation. Here, recitations of the Sundarkand provide an example that nicely ties down these moving pieces of vibration, soundscapes, and shanti. Translated into English as the Beautiful Book, the Sundarkand is the fifth part of Tulsidasa's Ramcharitmanas, which, for those of you who don't know, is basically one of the most famous tellings of the Ramayana, certainly the most famous telling in North India. And it details the exploits of Hanuman as he flies over the ocean to Lanka, converses with Sita, and burns Ravan's city to the ground. It's a massively popular and widely read text throughout India, written in a medieval Hindi that, although not simple, is far more accessible than Vedic Sanskrit. In Pushkar, groups of men get together on Tuesdays and Saturdays, which are considered auspicious days for the worship of Hanuman, to recite this beautiful book. Sandeep is a frequent singer in one of those groups, often meeting at the Hanuman temple by the shore of Pushkar Lake. Sound, he explained, has a profound effect on one's disposition. And when a horn blasts while you're walking, as when a horn blasts when you're walking the road. The Sundarkand, though, has a similar effect, but an entirely positive one. Its sound touches the soul, first with the ears, but then also by cleansing all the senses from within. And the Sundarkand is particularly effective not only because of Hanuman's grace, but also from the fact that recitation is done in large gatherings. Here is Sandeep on the power of numbers in recitation. Quote, "Actually, we do it all together. A person can't do it alone. 10, 20, 50 people do it. So when people come together for one particular thing and create sound, then there are vibrations. And the important thing is that brings shanti to our minds." So here we have a text in fairly accessible language telling a story so pervasive that it's said to be transmitted through mother's milk. And even still, its significance lies not in the poetry, its significance lies less in the poetry or the narrative or the lessons learned than in the feeling of peace acquired when reading the text with others. It's the shanti. And while singing is likely the most effective means for purification and peace, listening matters too. Another Sundarkand enthusiast told me that if a man were in the midst of some nefarious deed, but then heard the recitation of the Sundarkand, its vibratory power would stop him in his tracks. This is why the recitation is always performed with microphones and speakers, cranked to 11, and why the speakers are sometimes directed out towards the lake, where the sound is amplified and thus propelled across it. So if you have ever sat with a singing group in India and felt your ears ache from the volume, know that this is at least in part because the singers there are trying to ensure that their words have maximum effect by bringing peace to as many people as possible. These ethnographic examples suggest at least two important points. First, and most plainly, peace absolutely and unequivocally does not require quiet. Second, we should not assume sacred sound to be a category wholly distinct from sacred space. Rather, it seems important that we begin to see how these things are linked, meaning how landscapes are in fact made sacred by their soundscapes. And of course, shanti is an important part of this. We can refer to Sandeep's claim that recitation is spiritually significant for the very reason that it brings shanti to both singers and listeners across the town. That's true, too, of the old man chanting Ram on his microphone, and the Sanskrit students trying to save themselves and eventually all of India through something like Vedic vibration. And yet, from the very first ethnographic vignette I offered today of shanti at the bus station, we see an example of sacred space inherent. Said differently, on the one hand, shanti needs to be nurtured, cultivated, and created in real time. And yet, on the other, shanti is simply an attribute of Pushkar, regardless of horns or hassle, it just is. Interestingly, this relates much more broadly to Pushkar itself. See, to locals, Pushkar is more than just a gathering place for pilgrims and tourists. It's where Brahma, the creator of the universe, made his home. It's where people should feel blessed to stay, if only for a short time, and it's where locals would feel lucky to be reborn, if only as a pigeon. In short, it's their paradise. But here's the important proviso. Even paradise needs upkeep. So on a daily basis, the town's locals, and especially those engaged in pilgrimage and tourism, work to make Pushkar paradise. They do that with words and deeds, and yes, even sounds. This tension between the inherent and the idealistic on the one hand, and the more practical recognition of the need for improvement on the other, structures my larger book project. And as I hope you can begin to see, it's this very same tension that undergirds how shanti itself is perceived. The final issue I'd like to address today deals with vibrations, and the curious question as to where exactly this rhetoric comes from. I ask this question because, interestingly, when people in Pushkar mention the efficacy of efficacy of recitation alongside the rhetoric of sound or vibrations, they almost always use the English word vibration. In one case, an informant interchanged vibration with the Hindi word dhwani, meaning sound, echo, tune, tone, etc. And in another case, one friend told me that there was, quote, a very good word, a bahut acha naam, for vibration, but he couldn't recall it. This linguistic quirk seemed especially noticeable within the context of my fieldwork, where conversations almost exclusively happened in Hindi. Informants never used the Hindi word spandan, meaning vibrating or quivering, or its Sanskrit equivalent spanda, which has a pedigree linked to Kashmiri Shaivism. According to Mark Dykowski, spanda corresponds to, quote, the subtle vibration of the pure contemplation of one's own true nature and the supreme power of consciousness, which is God's most intimate and authentic attribute. So here, it's Shiva who is the pulsing radiance of consciousness. On the same philosophical tradition, André Padu explains that, quote, in its highest aspect, it is the vibration that is the essence of the absolute, end quote. But as far as I can tell, this notion of the pulsating radiance of consciousness forming the essence of the absolute seems to map only imperfectly onto what we see in Pushkar. Nor did informants ever use the Hindi word nad, meaning sound, or call upon its Sanskrit philosophical progenitor, nada brahman, which Guy Beck calls the, quote, sonic energy of the divine. Indeed, Pushkar's sonic theology relies almost solely on the English word vibrations, and never, in my experience, references any particular philosophical concept. So here lies the question, where does Pushkar's vibratory rhetoric come from? One answer is that the rhetoric doesn't come from anywhere, that it's Hindu and homegrown, and simply an English word in a world where English is fairly commonplace. That's fair enough, and for what it's worth, I fully agree that much of the rhetoric has Hindu roots. But a big part of me also sees globalization in action. In fact, I suspect that all of this language of vibration functions in a way somewhat akin to the phenomenon of globalization we call the pizza effect. Originally coined by Agananda Bharati, who was both a converted Hindu ascetic and a professor of anthropology at Syracuse University, the pizza effect was Bharati's way of explaining how certain things like yoga or certain guru movements increased in popularity in India only after going first to the United States. He saw a parallel in how pizza, which in Italy was originally considered a kind of uninteresting food for mostly poor folk, got transformed by Italian immigrants in the United States, who added cheese and exciting toppings. Cheese and exciting toppings. Then within a few years, amazingly, this new and refurbished pizza found its place on the menus of fancy and exclusive restaurants in, of all places, Italy. Thus, the pizza effect. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that vibratory rhetoric ever left India, or that it's only popular because of some increased prominence elsewhere, but rather that what we see in Pushkar is a completely cross-fertilized idea, something that looks like it does in part because of globalization and tourism. And we know for sure that vibratory rhetoric has been embraced in the United States. One need only visit a yoga studio or hang out with hippies to hear about vibes and vibrations. This is what I do in California, and it's everywhere. Just a few months ago, I went to a Bhakti Fest, a yoga and kirtan festival in Joshua Tree. There I met an amazing woman who went by the nickname Dub Goddess, and she told me that she loved trance music in particular because its vibrations cracked open her root chakra. And while Dub Goddess's appeal to trance may be a relatively new feature of the New Age, her vibration talk comes with quite a history, and even in the West. Take the example of Fritjof Capra, a physicist whose 1975 The Tao of Physics was inspired by a mystical experience in which he realized the working of the cosmos to be, quote, the dance of Shiva. On the vibrating universe, he notes, quote, modern physics, then, pictures matter not at all passive and inert, but as being in a continuous dancing and vibrating motion whose rhythmic patterns are determined by the molecular, atomic, and nuclear structures. This is also the way in which Eastern mystics see the material world. They all emphasize that the universe has to be grasped dynamically, as it moves, vibrates, and dances. That nature is not in a static but a dynamic equilibrium. Connecting Capra to Pushkar, I'm reminded of a conversation with a priest on one of the ghats by Pushkar Lake, where after an exposition on the importance of vibrations, the man looked at me with assured eyes and said, science ko mante hain. We acknowledge science. We know, of course, that the idea of a scientified Hinduism entailed conversations in India and, in fact, before Capra, and the directionality of all of this is very complicated. But it's also true that the connection between Capra and Pushkar and this Pushkar priest is not coincidental. That, I think, is something worth noting. Back to the United States and preceding Capra, we can also look to the Beach Boys' "Good Vibrations," which was massively famous and continues to be widely acclaimed as one of the greatest pop songs of all time. Amazingly, "Good Vibrations" was actually written a year before the song's lyricist Mike Love became interested in Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's transcendental meditation, which would later bring him to India with the Beatles, Donovan, and Mia and Prudence Farrow. Indeed, many of the better-known Indian figures that made contact with people in the United States and Europe also had a thing to say about vibrations. In the wildly popular autobiography of a yogi, published in 1946, Paramahamsa Yogananda explains that, quote, "The different sensory stimuli to which man reacts, tactual, visual, gustatory, auditory, and olfactory, are produced by vibratory variations in electrons and protons," end quote. And then he moves on to argue that great sages could actually materialize objects out of nothing by manipulating those vibratory variations in matter. In 1922, the great thinker Krishnamurti wrote a letter in California detailing a mystical experience in which he could, quote, "feel the vibrations of the Lord Buddha," and then sensed, quote, "such profound calmness both in the air and within myself, the calmness of the bottom of a deep, unfathomable lake," end quote. Here we see an interesting connection between peace and vibrations, and in California no less. But the language of vibrations goes even further back, still, to the New Thought movement and the work of William Walker Atkinson. In 1906, Atkinson published a book called Thought Vibration, or The Law of Attraction in the Thought World, in which he argues that, quote, when we send out vibrations of a fine ethereal substance, which are as real as the vibrations manifesting in light, heat, electricity, and magnetism. Perhaps even more interesting than this, however, is the fact that Atkinson was deeply inspired by Hindu thought, to the extent that he wrote several books under the pseudonyms Yogi Ramacharika and Swami Bhakta Vishita. With the latter's name, Atkinson published a pamphlet by the title of Mental Vibrations in Transmission. In fact, Atkinson was quite directly affected by Swami Vivekananda, who was one of the major figures in the birth of modern yoga, and who famously presented his version of Hinduism to the World's Parliament of Religions in 1883. With his charm and erudition, Vivekananda presented an exciting new option for countercultural Americans who rejected mainstream Protestantism, of which Atkinson was almost surely one. In a series of lectures given in New York, which were subsequently published in 1896 in a book titled Raja Yoga, Vivekananda talks in a way somewhat similar to the vibratory match theory that we've heard in Pushkar. "I am talking to you," Vivekananda says. "What am I trying to do? I am, so to say, bringing my mind to a certain state of vibration. And the more I succeed in bringing it to that state of vibration, the more you'll be affected by what I say." I am no Sanskrit scholar, but several of my colleagues who are have never seen anything in the pre-modern record that corresponds to what Vivekananda is saying here. And indeed, as Elizabeth de Michelis has argued, part of what makes Vivekananda so fascinating is that he was an incredibly flexible thinker, and that his ideas on Hinduism and yoga were shaped by intellectual debates in the United States happening at the very same time that he was making speeches and giving presentations. Thus, he was influenced by and influenced the New Thought movement. He had conversations in Boston with William James, who is one of the great luminaries of religious studies, and much of his thinking was influenced also by theosophy. With regard to vibrations, the connection to theosophy makes particular sense because Madame Blavatsky, the movement's founder, spoke as early as 1875 about the massive effect that vibrations have on all of us, humans and animals. So, the history of vibrations continues on and surely reaches farther back. At this stage, I'm at the tip of an iceberg that is more like an underwater Mount Everest. But when I look at the way in which the way people in Pushkar think about vibrations, not just the word, but the concept, it seems likely that locals are both more aware, and culturally closer to discourses of Vivekananda and globalized yoga than they are to those of Kashmiri Shaivism. Thus, I suggest that the vibratory language was exported out of India, picked up by Hindu philiacs in the 19th century, later carried forth by hippie interest in yoga and amorphous 60s spirituality, all the while being transformed by other Indian and Hindu thinkers, and all the while being continuously brought back and forth between India and the outside. So, is it possible that Pushkar's language of vibrations is all entirely indigenous and simply a word translated rather than a complex historical flow careening across the world and back again? Yes, sure, fine, definitely. But let's open ourselves up to this other possibility, what I honestly think is a likelihood, that when it comes to vibration talk today, there's no such thing as indigenous, just always already hybrid. Or, by way of conclusion, I might recall a moment from my fieldwork a few years back when I asked an informant about a phrase that I'd heard over and over and over again. Where does this idea come from? I asked. His response, it's not an idea, it's just true. Although at first frustrating, I now find such an answer both reassuring and broadly applicable. Maybe in applying that moment to the present matter, it's not so important where the idea of vibrations come from, because they're not an idea. For people in Pushkar, they're just true. Moreover, in trying to attend to my own excitements and annoyances and confusions and exasperations while disentangling this complex history of vibrations, I see only one really satisfying response. Shanti, shanti, shanti. Thank you.